Before we begin, if you like stories pulled from the cracks of forgotten history, where truth hides between what's written and what's lost, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. I didn't find Martha Elkin's story in a history book. It was tucked away in a pile of old crumbling school records, buried deep in a county archive. The file was thin, too thin for something that had haunted a prairie town for generations. There were only a few official notes, a class ledger, and 2 short witness statements from the search party. Still, even through the fragile paper, the story felt alive, as if it had been waiting to be read again. In 1877, Dakota Territory was a place where winter could kill you in a night. The rail lines hadn't reached that far yet, and homesteads sat miles apart. When the wind blew, nothing stood between you and the snow except what you built yourself. Martha was 22, fresh from a teacher's college in Ohio when she arrived that August. Her new home was a one-room schoolhouse at the edge of a settlement too small to appear on most maps. A simple clapboard building with a pot-belly stove and a narrow room attached for her to live in. 14 children attended her class, the sons and daughters of farmers and tradesmen ages 7 to 15. They walked miles to school, crossing frozen fields or following wagon tracks when the weather turned. By October, she had earned their respect, though not yet their confidence. The fall passed quietly with harvest fairs, Sunday church gatherings, and long evenings reading by lamplight. But that winter changed everything. In early December, a warning came from the post rider. A storm was coming from the northwest. Families stocked up on grain and salted meat. The schoolhouse pantry was meager, some flour-lard beans, pickles, and a small crate of potatoes. Enough for a week, maybe 2. On December 15th, the sky turned gray, heavy, and still. Parents sent their children to school thinking the snow would wait until night. By noon, the wind howled through the cracks, and the windows rattled. Martha looked out and saw only white. By the time lessons ended, snow had piled waist-high against the door. Sending the children home would have been suicide. Their families lived miles away across open prairie. She made the call they'd stay until the storm passed. Desks were pushed aside, blankets spread by the stove. That first night they were crowded but warm, their voices low, the air thick with pine smoke. She told them stories to calm their nerves, but their eyes kept drifting toward the dark windows. The storm howled louder, and by dawn the fire had gone out, the glass frozen over from the inside. Martha used more wood than she meant to, just to keep them from freezing. By morning, they were snowed in completely. The second day, she served thin porridge and weak tea. She wrote in her ledger that the children bear it well so far. But the woodpile was shrinking fast. By the third day, the wind's roar never stopped, a constant animal sound pressing on the walls. The children stayed close to the fire. They stopped asking when they could go home. On the 4th night, Martha heard something outside, slow, heavy footsteps moving past the wall. She told herself it was just snow shifting. Still, she sat awake until dawn, hands tight around a cold mug of tea. Days blurred together. The storm buried them deeper. The windows froze over, the light dimmed, and the schoolhouse became a tomb of flickering lamplight and creaking wood. She marked each day in her ledger with a line more out of faith than certainty. By the 5th day, the bread was gone. She rationed potatoes, 3 slices each. When those ran out, she moved to beans, watered down to stretch longer. Firewood vanished next. She began burning desks, starting with the broken ones. By the 7th day, sickness came. Little Samuel coughed through class, burning with fever. She moved him near the stove, gave him extra tea, and stayed up writing. Samuel, unwell, must watch. By morning, he was still, his small hands folded neatly. She sat beside him for a long time before moving him to the storeroom. The others didn't ask. They already knew. The storm never stopped. Hunger hollowed their faces. Martha spoke less now. At night she calculated supplies. By lamplight, her handwriting smaller each day. On the 10th night, she heard tapping on the roof, irregular, deliberate. It stopped when she listened too closely. The next morning, she checked the storeroom. Nothing had changed. On the 11th day, the wind no longer raged. It breathed. It pressed against the walls like something alive, slipping through cracks as fine as dust. Every sound in the room felt like trespassing. Martha gave each child a spoonful of thin broth, a sliver of carrot, a drop of lard. She kept the ledger open beside her as if its order could keep them safe. When the fire smoked back through the stovepipe, she wiped her eyes and began lessons again. The children recited softly, their voices thin. Thomas and Ruth, the oldest, exchanged a look that spoke of something beyond schoolwork. That afternoon, Thomas tried the door again. It had become his daily ritual, testing the snow, searching for hope. He pushed until the latch groaned, but gave only an inch. "We could dig up," he said. "If we take turns, use the pail. The air's better higher. We could reach the road." Martha listened quietly, her voice calm when she finally answered the way you'd speak when numbers don't add up and you don't want anyone to see you already know the result. She walked to the window and scraped a circle of frost with her thumbnail. Outside was nothing but white, no sky, no ground, no sense of where one ended and the other began. She pressed her hand to the glass, felt the faint dampness, and said quietly that if the trench collapsed, they'd lose heat and time, and if it held, the wind would steal both. They would wait. Ruth's jaw tightened. "We could leave in pairs," she said. "My father's pasture is only 2 miles. If we keep the school in sight, you'd lose it in 10 steps." Martha said not harshly, but with a tone of truth. She looked at their cracked boots and their raw hands, at the small faces behind them, waiting for someone else to decide. Then she told Thomas to tend the stove, Ruth to sort the remaining books, and the decision settled itself the way impossible things often do, by becoming too heavy to lift again. That night the tapping came back. It started in one corner of the roof, moved toward the chimney, then returned slow and deliberate. Martha counted the pauses until numbers lost their meaning. Barefoot she crossed the cold floor, unlocked the storeroom door, listened to the air breathing there, and closed it again. When she turned, Ruth was sitting up, eyes hollow and too old for her face. "What is that sound?" she asked, her voice a whisper that had been waiting in the air. "Snow settling," Martha said. "Sometimes it has bones." Ruth didn't question the strange words. She only turned toward the wall and pretended to sleep. On the 13th day, a crate of slates was broken up for fuel. On the 14th, the classroom map fed the stove piece by piece, Virginia curling into flame, then Iowa, then Nebraska, as if the land itself were being erased and remade. The children said nothing. They had learned silence was energy. They held their cups with both hands and pretended not to notice how little there was to fill them. By the 15th day, a new smell lingered in the room, faint and unplaceable. It drifted from the kettle and hid again when the steam rose. Ruth sniffed once, uncertain, and Thomas didn't look up at all. At night, the children slept in small clusters, their breathing soft and tidal, like the ocean Martha once read to them about. She used those hours to calculate her pencil, barely a nub, writing slowly, as if delay itself could stop time. She listed names, blankets, lent fires tended, but not the other things she was beginning to keep track of. By dusk, the light thinned and Thomas scraped a new hole in the frost. "It's brighter," he said, more hope than statement. Martha looked with him. The white outside had softened, showing a faint suggestion of direction. Whether it was promise or only illusion, she couldn't tell. "We'll try the door tomorrow," she said. "Let the night make up its mind first." The next morning, the wind was gone. Silence filled its place. They ate what was left, then gathered while Thomas pushed at the door. Snow fell inward in a soft collapse, spilling across the floor. He laughed a quick, startled sound and stopped himself. Martha stepped into the drift, testing for solid ground beneath. It was there, faint but real. The cold rushed in, biting at their lungs, but it was air from outside air that hadn't been trapped with them. Martha said they'd dig a path to the privy and no farther. They needed a line to the pump, proof that the world still existed the way they remembered. They tied themselves with rope to the stove 2 by 2 and stepped into the snow. When they came back, cheeks burning red, they carried 2 buckets packed with snow to melt and news that the world still existed. Flat, pale, endless. The pump was buried, the privy gone except for the frame of its door. Ruth said it looked like a gallows. Martha told her not to use that word, and Ruth apologized without knowing why. They melted snow, boiled it, and drank. For a brief hour, the room felt almost alive again. That night, a brittle page tore from Martha's ledger. She folded it into the grammar book where they'd once underlined predicate and subject. Next to object 1 of the children had drawn a small, 6-pointed star. She traced it with her finger, then closed the book. The tapping didn't come back, but a faint sound did a settling in the storeroom, soft as cloth, remembering the weight it once covered. Martha lay awake and listened, matching her breathing to the slow draw of the stove, until she convinced herself it was nothing. At dawn, she opened the storeroom again. The air was sharp and wrong. 3 empty spaces showed where jam jars had been. The folded blanket had shifted. She closed the door, slid the key into her pocket, and made hot water taste faintly like tea. When the others woke, no one asked, and she didn't offer. On the 17th day, frost coated the room itself. The desks, the walls, even the pegs for coats shimmered with ice that wouldn't melt. When they spoke, their words lingered visibly before fading. The rope from yesterday's digging lay coiled by the door, a reminder that outside wasn't salvation, only a wider kind of cold. After their morning meal, water thickened with a pinch of flour. Thomas stood by the door again. This time he didn't mention the pump or privy. He wanted to go farther to reach the settlement. Ruth stood beside him, arms folded ready. "We can make it," she said, "if we leave at dawn and keep each other in sight." Martha didn't answer right away. She was sewing a thin patch into a blanket, each motion slow and steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "And if the wind returns when you're half a mile out, then we keep walking," Ruth said too quickly. The children had gone still, their eyes flicking between them. Martha rose, walked to the door, and opened it, just long enough for the cold to sweep in. The snow outside was blinding. She let them feel it, the sharpness of still air, before closing the door again. "You wouldn't reach the fence line," she said. "And if you did, there'd be no one there." The words ended the argument, though not the unrest behind it. The day dragged. Ruth sat by the stove, staring into the fire. Thomas wound and unwound the rope until his hands turned red. That night, the sound came again, a slow drag across the roof, heavier than before. The wind was silent, so the sound stood out in the stillness. Martha sat upright, shawl tight around her shoulders. Ruth was already awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "What is it?" she whispered. "Snow," Martha said, quieter this time, as if the word itself might listen. The dragging stopped. Then came a single muffled thump from the storeroom, the kind of sound something makes when it's removed from a pile. In the morning, the smell from the kettle was richer, The steam curled thicker, heavier. The children ate quietly, spoons scraping against tin. Ruth paused once, her spoon hovering mid-air, then lowered it. Thomas didn't look up at all. Martha refilled her bowl before the kettle was empty, her movements slow and deliberate. She made a note in the ledger supplies, holding steady, and no one asked how. That afternoon, while the children dozed, Ruth stopped her near the desk. Her voice was quiet, but her words had the edge of certainty. What happens in that room? Martha met her eyes without hesitation. Things that keep us here, she said. Ruth didn't ask again. She went back to her place by the stove, wrapped herself in the blanket Martha had mended, and stared into the fire until the coals dimmed. That night, no one mentioned the rope by the door. On the 19th day, the sky darkened without warning. Morning had been silver and dull, but by afternoon a wall of gray advanced across the horizon, steady and unbroken. The air inside the schoolhouse changed, first its chill, deeper, sharper. Martha felt it in the creak of the boards, in the way the walls seemed to brace themselves. She told the children to pull their pallets close to the stove. And they did, forming a ring around the fading warmth. The wind came back with a cruel voice searching every seam in the wood. Martha stuffed rags into the cracks and closed the inner door, shrinking their world to one small, smoky room. The air grew heavy with the scent of burning pine and something faintly metallic from the stove. By evening, the windows were black, trembling under the weight of snow pressing in from outside. Martha served dinner with care, each bowl portioned and passed by hand. Her own serving came last, thicker than before. The children noticed, but said nothing, lingering over their spoons, as if savoring more than food. It was that second night of the storm when Caleb disappeared. He was 12, quiet and obedient, and gone by dawn. His blanket lay folded at the edge of his bedroll, his boots neatly placed beside it. The door was latched from the inside. There were no tracks where the snow had crept beneath the frame. Thomas found the empty space first, crouching beside it, as though he might find Caleb if he stared long enough. Ruth checked the storeroom door. It was locked. Martha gathered them close, her voice calm and measured. Caleb must have gone outside before dawn, she said, and lost his way in the storm. The words were practiced, even almost soothing. No one argued, but silence took on a weight of its own. She did not open the storeroom that day. The storm raged for 2 more days, burying the schoolhouse until the windows blurred into the walls. The air inside turned stale. The stove coughed weakly, and the last of the wood dwindled to splinters. Martha rationed heat now, letting the fire die until fingers went numb before feeding it again. When the children finally slept, tangled together in their blankets, she sat by the faint glow, ledger open, pencil in hand. She wrote Caleb's name in the margin, added a small mark beside it, then closed the book. She listened not for wind, but for the soft, careful sounds coming from behind the storeroom door. At dawn, she unlocked it alone. The hinges groaned, and a cold draft slid around her. She went in, stayed less than a minute, and came out with the kettle in both hands. Breakfast was served in silence. When the storm broke on the 23rd day, light returned through the uncovered windows, but the room remained dim. The air was clearer, yet the heaviness lingered. The children did not rush to see the sky. They stayed near the stove, drawn inward, their bodies small and watchful. Something had shifted, not in the weather, but in them. Thomas no longer looked at Martha when she spoke, answering only in short words. Ruth watched her constantly now, not with admiration, but distance. The younger ones were restless but quiet. Their play restrained every sound, met by silence. Martha noticed. She always noticed. But she went on as before, teaching, measuring, stirring the kettle. The storeroom stayed locked, the key always in her pocket. No one spoke of Caleb, though Thomas's steps slowed each time he passed that door, as if memory tugged at him. That night, when the room had gone still, Ruth feigned sleep. Beneath her blanket, she watched as Martha rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and crossed to the back of the room. The key turned softly in the lock, careful enough to almost disappear under the crackle of dying embers. The door opened just wide enough for her to slip through. Ruth counted the seconds. 103. When Martha returned, her shawl clutched close, the faint trace of steam followed her. She poured water into the kettle, bent over the stove, and stirred with steady hands. Ruth closed her eyes before Martha turned. In the morning, the smell from the kettle was different again. Richer, fuller, something that wasn't unpleasant, but carried a weight of its own. The children ate without question. Hunger doesn't leave room for refusal. Later, when Martha stepped outside to check the trench, Ruth whispered to Thomas, telling him what she had seen. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She pressed for a plan. He only shook his head once. That night, Ruth stayed awake again. This time, others did too. By the 25th day, the air inside the schoolhouse felt heavier than the snow outside ever had. The sky beyond the window was a perfect pale blue, the kind of calm that would have meant beauty anywhere else. Here it only made the silence louder. Every scrape of a spoon, every small movement sounded too sharp, too close, as if the walls themselves were listening. That morning, Samuel Dorr, 15, broad-shouldered, one of the last strong enough to help Thomas with the trench, didn't wake. His blanket lay twisted, his boots still at the foot of his bedroll, and the space where his body should have been was cold. Thomas was the first to notice. He moved quickly through the room, checking the door. The windows, even the narrow crawl space beneath the teacher's quarters. Outside, the snow was untouched. No tracks, no sign of departure. Ruth's eyes turned toward the storeroom. The door was closed, the key still hanging from the cord in Martha's pocket. She said nothing, but her silence carried an accusation. Martha stood at the front of the room, hands clasped, and told them Samuel must have wandered off in the night like Caleb. The cold, she said, could take a person before they even realized they were lost. Her voice was steady, but her gaze lingered on each face long enough to make doubt feel dangerous. Before noon, the kettle was simmering. Its scent was stronger now, warm, rich, almost comforting, though not quite. The younger children ate quickly. The older ones hesitated, but followed. Hunger doesn't allow rebellion. That evening, Ruth cornered Thomas while the others fed the fire. Her voice was urgent. This was their moment, she said. If they were ever going to see what was behind that door, it had to be now. Thomas hesitated. The key was always with Martha. She never left them alone long enough to act. When night came, Ruth pretended to stir in her sleep, pacing near Martha under the pretense of restlessness. She saw the key glint faintly at her pocket. Thomas, on the other side of the room, stoked the stove. But before either could move, Martha stood. Without a word, she walked to the storeroom, unlocked the door, and slipped inside. The latch clicked shut behind her. Ruth and Thomas froze. Seconds stretched long enough to turn into minutes. When Martha reappeared, she carried the kettle's steam curling faintly from its rim. She poured a small amount into her cup, drank, then met their eyes one by one before sitting down. Neither of them tried again that night, but they didn't have to. Martha had seen the thought in their faces. On the 26th day, silence finally broke. It happened just after breakfast. The children were gathered in their circle bowls, steaming in the weak light. Thomas set his spoon down, looked straight at Martha, and said, "We need to know what's in the storeroom." His voice was calm, but carried enough weight to stop every sound in the room. "If we're going to survive," deserve to know." The words hung in the air like breath freezing in front of them. Ruth watched. The younger children looked from face to face, sensing something had shifted. Martha didn't respond right away. She finished her spoonful, set the bowl aside, and folded her hands. "You have food. You have heat. You have shelter," she said evenly. "The storeroom is my concern. Yours is to live long enough to see spring. That's exactly the problem," Thomas said. "Two people gone, and every time you go into that room, you come back with food." "You never said we had. If there's more, we can plan. If there's not, if there's not." Martha interrupted, her tone still even then. "What? You'll lead them out into the wind. You'll dig through the snow until it buries you. You'll do better with empty hands." The quiet that followed was sharp enough to hurt. Then Ruth spoke, her voice low but clear. "If it's only food, there's nothing to hide." Martha turned her gaze to her. "And if it's the only reason you're still alive?" The fire cracked, throwing a spark up the chimney. No one said another word. Lessons resumed, but the rhythm was gone. Every look between Ruth and Thomas carried more meaning. The younger children clung closer to them now than to Martha. But when it came time to eat, every bowl was scraped clean as before. That night the schoolhouse felt colder, even with the fire burning. The wind pressed at the walls like something searching for a way in. Martha stayed up late writing in her ledger with slow, steady strokes. Thomas lay awake watching her. Ruth sat by the stove until the coals turned gray, waiting. The stillness between them felt like a battle that had already begun. On the 28th day, morning arrived clear and sharp. The sky was a hard, pale blue sunlight, cutting through the frost in narrow beams. Dust floated in the air like an upside-down snowfall. Thomas was already at the door when Martha rose. He had the rope slung over his shoulder, a shovel in his hand, and Ruth beside him, coat buttoned to the throat. "We're clearing more than the trench today," he said. "We need to see how far we can go." Martha met his eyes, then looked past him to the children huddled near the stove. "Stay within sight of the door," she said quietly. "If the wind changes, you come back." They nodded, though everyone knew promises like that didn't hold much weight anymore. Outside, the world was blinding. The snow shone so fiercely they had to squint beneath their hoods. They widened the trench, the shovels biting into ice-hardened layers of storm after storm. When Ruth's shovel struck something solid, the sound was dull and wrong. She dropped to her knees, brushed away the snow, and uncovered a slab of old wood stained dark where the ice hadn't reached. Thomas cleared more, revealing an edge than a seam. It wasn't fence wood or part of the privy. It was a door, low, narrow, set into the ground. They stared at it, neither speaking. There was no handle, just a rusted iron ring, half buried in the ice. Thomas gripped it, pulled, but it wouldn't move. Ruth chipped at the edges until the ice cracked loose. Together they heaved. The wood lifted with a long groaning sound, and a burst of air escaped, cold, stale, and ancient. The darkness below didn't begin where the light ended. It swallowed the light whole. A narrow set of wooden steps led downward, disappearing into shadow after the third. Ruth leaned forward, squinting. For a moment she thought she saw shelves lining the wall shapes draped in cloth. No sound rose from below, but the air carried a faint metallic sweetness that didn't belong to the snow or the earth. Thomas moved toward the steps, but Martha's voice cut through the stillness like a drawn wire. "Close it." They turned. She stood at the far end of the trench, her coat unbuttoned, her breath a pale mist in the sunlight. Her tone was quiet, but it carried the weight of something that allowed no argument. Ruth hesitated. Thomas looked once more into the darkness, then back at Martha. Without a word, he pulled the door down. The sound it made closing heavy final seemed to echo long after the latch settled. They shoveled snow over it again, though neither of them said it was to keep the cold out. When they returned, Martha was already inside, standing by the stove. The kettle hissed softly. She didn't ask what they'd seen, and they didn't tell her. Still, something in the room had changed. The air felt thinner, as if a piece of it had been taken outside and buried with the door. That night, the smell from the kettle was stronger. Ruth couldn't shake the image of the dark cellar, the shelves, the shapes beneath the cloth, the breath of frozen air that had crept up from it. She watched Martha move between the stove and her desk, calm, deliberate, her expression as mild as always. But Ruth knew she had seen the truth in Martha's eyes, the quiet certainty that the teacher already knew what they'd uncovered. By nightfall, Ruth had decided she couldn't wait for Thomas. He would want to talk to plan to hesitate. The thought of what lay beneath that door had burrowed too deeply. She waited until Martha's pencil slowed, until her head dipped forward in sleep. Then, silent as she could, Ruth slipped from her blanket. The boards creaked faintly, but Martha didn't stir. The rope still hung by the door where Thomas had left it. Ruth took it, looped it over her shoulder, and stepped outside. The cold struck her like a blow. The moonlight made the snow glow faintly, the trench a silver scar, cutting through the dark. She followed it to the drift breath sharp in her throat. The snow they'd replaced was soft, easy to move. The ring of the buried door was cold enough to burn through her gloves. She pulled. The wood lifted with a long, reluctant groan, and a wave of frozen air spilled out. It smelled faintly of metal and something older. She descended one step at a time, her boots thudding softly on the wood. The shelves were real. Rough planks stretched along the wall, each holding a shape beneath a sheet of cloth. Ruth pulled one covering back. Beneath it was a small boot cracked stiff with frost still laced. Her breath stopped. She lifted another cloth. A coat. Caleb's coat. The same patched elbow she had mended weeks ago. Her hand trembled. The air pressed closer around her. On the lowest shelf, half in shadow, something glinted faintly. She crouched, lifting the edge of another cloth. Beneath it sat a tin bowl. What lay inside was dark, shapeless, but unmistakably human in suggestion. A sound came from above the crunch of a boot in the snow. She froze. The pale rectangle of light at the top of the steps dimmed, filled now by a still figure. "You should be asleep, Ruth." Martha's voice was calm, almost gentle. Ruth's throat tightened. "What is this place?" she whispered. Martha paused. "The reason we're still alive?" She took one step down, then another, until her face came into the faint spill of moonlight. "Come up. You'll catch your death down here." Ruth's gaze darted toward the shelves, toward the shape still hidden. But in the end, she climbed. Martha closed the door behind them, brushing snow back over it in smooth, practiced strokes. When they re-entered the schoolhouse, the stove burned hotter than Ruth remembered the kettle already whispering to a boil. Ruth didn't speak again that night. She lay awake, her body rigid beneath her blanket, the image of those shelves frozen in her mind. Morning came slow and pale. Martha moved about as usual, stirring the fire, checking the windows, noting in her ledger. But every motion felt sharpened, now stripped of any softness. Ruth waited until the children were busy at their slates. Then she crossed to where Thomas was stacking wood. Her voice was barely a breath. "I found it. The door." I went inside. Thomas froze, his hand still on a log. "When last night," she said quickly, "there are shelves. Things covered. Caleb's coat, Samuel's boot, and more." She hesitated. "She's keeping them there." Thomas didn't look toward Martha, but his jaw tightened. "You're sure I saw enough?" Then tonight, he said, When she sleeps, we take the key, open it together, and show everyone. The plan was simple, but the knowing between them made it heavy. All day they moved like people carrying glass. Martha's calm remained, but her glances toward them were too frequent, too measured. When night fell, Ruth waited for the steady rhythm of Martha's breathing, the quiet drift that would signal sleep. But it never came. Martha didn't sit by the stove that night. She moved slowly through the room, pausing by each child, adjusting a blanket here, a lock of hair there. Her hands were steady, but her eyes never left the edges of the room. Ruth lay motionless under her blanket, heart pounding, realizing that Martha wasn't waiting to sleep. She was waiting for them. Instead, Martha rose and took the kettle from the stove. The sound of the liquid pouring into her mug broke the silence, and the smell that drifted through the room was stronger than ever. Richer, heavier, almost sweet. In the dim light, Thomas met Ruth's eyes, and she understood without words that the plan was over for the night. Martha didn't sleep. She sat by the stove until dawn, the firelight painting her face in long, flickering lines. When morning came, she served them as if nothing had changed, her voice calm, her motions deliberate. But when she handed Ruth her portion, her fingers lingered on the rim of the bowl. "You need your strength," she said. Ruth drank. The broth was hot and thick, the warmth settling in her stomach like something alive. Thomas didn't speak to her until later, when the children were bent over their books. His voice was low, almost lost in the rustle of pages. She knows. After that, silence became their only safety. The cold grew sharper with each night. By the 31st, the air inside the schoolhouse was brittle, the walls groaning under the wind. Ruth woke before dawn and knew something was wrong. Thomas's bed was empty, his boots gone, the door still latched from within. Martha sat by the stove, the ledger open on her knees. "Where's Thomas?" Ruth asked. "Gone out," Martha said without looking up. "He thought he could find the settlement." Ruth's stomach turned. In the middle of the night, Martha turned another page. "Some people think they can outrun the cold," she said. "They're usually wrong." By morning, there was no search. Lessons continued. The world moved as if he'd never existed. The rope and shovel were gone, the pallets drawn tighter to the fire. When Martha caught Ruth watching her pocket, she smiled faintly. "You'll have to help with the fire. We're fewer now." That night, the smell from the kettle was rich and warm. Ruth forced herself to eat each swallow thick as guilt. She knew she was alone in what she'd seen, and Martha knew it too. The rescue came on the 39th day. A dull, rhythmic thud shook the wall, then voices in the wind. When Martha opened the door, men stepped through, faces, raw coats crusted with frost. "Dakota Territorial Guard," one said. "We've been digging for days." Martha nodded. "You took your time." They counted the survivors. 14 at the start, Martha said. Fewer now. Cold and sickness took the rest. The men offered blankets, food, warmth. One sniffed the air near the stove. "Didn't think you'd have stew left." "You learned to make do," Martha replied. They led the children back to the settlement. Ruth looked behind her, once seeing Martha in the doorway, her breath rising like smoke. The storeroom door stayed closed. Whatever waited inside would remain buried beneath the snow. In town, Martha's story became legend, the teacher who'd saved her class. The papers called her brave. The townspeople called her blessed. Only Ruth knew what hadn't been said. When she tried to tell the officers, they dismissed her gently. No wrongdoing, they said. Memory plays tricks. Years passed. Ruth built a new life, but the winter of 1877 never left her. 2 decades later, she returned to the plains. The settlement was gone, but the schoolhouse still stood broken, silent, unchanged. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and memory. The storeroom door hung open, its lock red with rust. She stepped in. The shelves were empty, but the stains remained dark, deep, unmoving. In one corner lay a dented tin bowl, faintly ringed where something had once rested. Ruth set it back, closed the door, and walked into the falling snow. Some rooms, she thought, keep their own seasons, and some winters never end.